On the day that my mother died, my sister, who was my twin, and who quite frankly I was estranged from in a lot of ways, was upstairs overdosing on my mother's care package, the drugs that she was given. And it was just, it was one of those moments where it all collided, and it was a really difficult time for me. I wanted to be sitting in honor of my mother, and meanwhile I was upstairs directing traffic, administering CPR, tending to that emergency and crisis. I remember the day as clearly as I remember any day, having to go outside and just collapsing.
Welcome to The Deep Coach, the podcast where we explore the transformational journeys that shape us and that propel us to change the world. I'm your host, Jonathan Hermida, and in each episode, we sit down with those who have journeyed into the depths of spiritual transformation and who are now reshaping the world through their presence and their work. In listening to these inspiring human beings, you'll find insight, inspiration, and practical tools that'll support your journey as a coach and as a human being. Today, I'm joined by Christopher Bolling, and I gotta say that this conversation has really stayed with me, not just because of all that Chris has been through, but because of how honestly and soulfully he talks through everything. Christopher spent nearly 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder, doing all the right things, until something in him knew it was time to pause. He took a sabbatical, he went off the grid to a cabin on the Madison River in Montana, and spent nearly 2 months fly fishing, reading, and really just being. He thought he was just taking a break, but really that was the beginning of everything shifting. A few years later, his life collapsed in many ways. His career ended, his marriage was unraveling, his mom passed, and his sister overdosed that very same day. That moment cracked him open, and from that place, he began a deeper journey of healing, self-discovery, and awakening. Christopher is now an executive coach who leads with heart, presence, and soul, and he's someone who has done the deep work, and it really does show in every word that he speaks. We talk about grief, identity, nature, coaching, and what it means to live a life that's not split into compartments, but built in alignment with who you really are. This one's rich. I hope you love it.
In 2011, you mentioned that after 17 years of being in the same corporate environment, you decided to take a step back and go on sabbatical. And we're going to dive into all of that. And I'm curious the motivation behind that. What I'm curious about before we get into all of that is, who was Christopher Bolling before you got to this point? So to add more nuance, in those 17 years, what was driving you? What was motivating you? What was propelling you forward?
I always had that thought in my mind that what's most important for me is to be a contribution. And in the world of work, it was, whenever I showed up, it's how am I going to contribute today? And that was a thing that was always in the back of my mind, right? And that is, what is it I need to do? And in that case, right, propel the organization forward. And for me, it fostered a lot of growth, quite frankly, when you show up that way. And then in 2011, so after about 17 years in my career, I've been, Christopher Bolling was a father. Christopher Bolling was an executive, who was a member of the community. He was really active in the community. And I just needed a break. It's sort of what I realized is that there's a couple of things that came together for me. And one was, my son was getting older. He was about 13 years old. I wanted to spend some time with him, in a removed setting from everyday life. And there's also a call to nature. I mean, that's one of the things that's always been important in my life. And so I grabbed a bunch of books, grabbed a bunch of fly rods, found a cabin on a river in the middle of Montana, and disconnected from my everyday life and really immersed myself in the wilderness of Montana and the rivers of Montana. And it was really an extraordinary experience. And, oftentimes all I'll say is I wasn't soul searching. That wasn't the motivation. The motivation was just to do things that I loved and enjoyed and hadn't had a lot of time to immerse myself in. And along the way, I found myself, right? Along the way, what became apparent to me are all the things that I hadn't been tending to. And, when I think about that, it's being outside and, this will be a common thread probably in our conversation, but being outdoors is my connection to everything that's important. And, it lends to perspective and it really connects me to the things that in my life, and, the things that I value. So here I am in the middle of Montana and, I'll call that like the spark of awakening. And part of that, quite frankly, Jonathan, was self-care. And, when you're leading a bit busy life and you have these personas, right? The executive, the father, the travel hockey dad, the, school board member, there isn't often a lot of space there. And so for me, what happened was, in that space and in the vast skies of Montana, um, really started to become aware of things that filled my soul and that were necessary for me in order to be like a whole vital person, right? And I would have told you at any one point in time that those things, that I was really happy doing what I was doing, and I wouldn't go back on that. It's like all of the roles that I was playing in the world, I was really happy, and I felt good about what that looked like. But then there's this whole other dimension that comes to you, in the context of, just pressing pause and stepping into, beauty, I think.
Pressing pause and stepping into beauty. You had also mentioned that there were things that were discovered on that trip that you weren't tending to. What were some of those things that you weren't tending to?
Well, I know it now differently than I knew it then, right? And I think nature is my spiritual connection. And, I spent a lot of time outdoors, even in the context of the roles that I was playing, but it wasn't really tending to that, is that soulfulness of me as a person, right? In the language of Leon, or, sort of in that deep coaching work, it's stage 3, right? It's power by achievement. And I was fully immersed in that and feeling really good about that again. It was something. I was happy. Like I was feeling very fulfilled. And I actually didn't know anything was missing. At the time, I just, everything was going fine for me and there wasn't really anything that I thought was missing. But when I stepped into the wilderness, what I realized is what comes to you through being in time and space and being held in, nature, was this, I'll just call it the awakening of my soul, right? It's just, it was really there for me and it really started to burgeon in that sense. And even when I came back, what happened was I was very energized, right? I was very energized to develop myself as a person. The first thing I went out and did when I came back from that was I found an executive coach. And, because I thought if I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to really lean into this thing. I'm going to sort of develop as a person and do the things that I think are most important for me. So I came back with this just renewed sense of energy and a mantra in my head, right? I lived in a beautiful place. I lived in coastal California, amongst the redwoods and the ocean. And I thought, I'm going to give myself a vacation every day, no matter what happens, right? Whatever comes along, that I'm going to spend some time outdoors and gift myself that every day, because I knew that was one of the things that had me showing up in a much different way when I came back from my sabbatical. So when I think about being whole and capable as a leader, it was really important for me to make sure that I was sort of in that space, right, that allowed for that to show up in its fullness.
So making sure that you had the space to tend to your inner being and be in the right inner environment, right, to support the
Yeah,
external stuff.
yeah, yeah. I mean, so in my work, I'm an executive coach now, but in my work, what I know is that, like, if we're tending to our whole self, we tend to be better leaders. Right.
Yeah.
That was my experience when I started to really tend to that, even in, what we call the busyness of the day and, the fullness of the schedule and the fullness of the things that we're tending to. When we really, really focus inward in terms of, what it is that I require, to show up and live my values every day, to show up and be the best leader that I could be every day. What I realized is, again, that I just really hadn't been tending to that in a way that was as meaningful as it otherwise could be. And then when I gifted myself that time and space, I mean, I think we all have some experience of sort of that vitality that starts to come out through us. And that was the thing that was happening with me, right? That was the thing that was, just really coming forward.
That was part of my curiosity when you mentioned the spark of awakening. What are some of the nuances that you began to discover or tap into within yourself?
I think it's rather than nuances, it became questions, right? It became a question of, well, what will this look like for me as I move forward? Who will I be? As I continue to do the things that I need to be doing. Like, and if I consider that sabbatical and I do a recalibration point in my life, where will I be? I started to envision something that was really different than the life that I was living, which can be a little bit unsettling, right? It's like I am attached to the ecosystem, and I've come back to it now. That's where I live now. So I live, in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And because it was such a driving force in my life, it just started to ask bigger questions. And, that was the nuance, right? It's like, okay, I'm on this, I've done the things that I wanted to do. I'm successful in the career that I'm leading. I felt really good about my connection with my son and my family at the time. And, all of those things were there, but it's like, okay, who will I emerge to be out of, what this is, and where does this all go for me?
You mentioned your relationships were already good, and then you started questioning some just yourself, and that started to shift things for you. How did your relationships begin to change as a result of that inner questioning?
One of them was actually really unsettling. And, so my relationship with my son remains, strong, and it's always been strong. The people in my life were, very important to me. And I'm a person that tends to relationship was really important. My wife at the time said to me on the back end of that trip, that was one of the most boring things I've ever done. And, for me, that was a bit of a lightning bolt. It was one of those moments of, um, yeah, just distress, when I thought about it, because I knew, like at the time, I knew that that was the life I wanted to live. And, the idea of, it felt like a cleaver had come between us at that moment. And it was it's a really difficult time, and fairly unsettling for me. And, we continued to sort of be in the relationship, and, she's a beautiful woman with a really kind heart. And so that was really challenging for me, because the relationship wasn't strained or stressed, aside from the vision that I was holding, sort of in my heart. So that became, sort of a difficult part. And one of the things that started to sort of energize the questions that I was asking for myself. And, one of those questions became, can I give up on this vision? Can I have a compromise in that vision? And, the answer for me at the time was a resounding no. I mean, it was, this is something that, I could feel. I could feel it in my heart. It was carrying it in my soul. And, so that for me was, again, it was distressful. I've been married for 20 years, and, at the time, again, everything was going right. So for her, it was also really challenging, because, we'd lived a really happy life together, and, we'd raised a really beautiful boy together. And when that, when that mindset shifted for me, it really did put it into a bit of a tumult, right? And it was a challenging time for us.
What helped you to navigate that time?
I don't know if anything helped me to navigate that time. It's like, what happened is I think I started to become a little bit more isolated. In terms of, so when I was in nature and doing the things that I was loving. So even, you know, after work, I'd always make some time and space to get outside and go for a paddle or go for a mountain bike ride or get into the redwoods or, onto the ocean. And I could come back with some sense of balance, and that was really helpful for me. But in terms of, the challenge that I was facing in terms of where I wanted to go versus where my wife wanted to go, I don't know that, I was able to stay balanced, and I don't think anything snuck out sideways in terms of behavior then. But it was a really challenging time because you're always carrying this thing in your head, right? And that is, I don't think we're on the same path any longer.
Yeah. And then everything came to a head in 2015. Can you describe that time period?
Yeah. Oftentimes I think of it, when you're on a linear or, somewhat linear path, and then all of a sudden, it all happens. And my company decided to go from public to private. The role that I was playing was no longer necessary. So this, executive Chris, was instantly gone. So I ended up, after spending again, the balance of my career as single place, working to be a contribution that was no longer in existence. My mother had been battling Parkinson's for over a decade, and it was a really slow decline. And at that very same time, she was sitting in home hospice in her final days. I then was in the middle of a divorce. And on the day that my mother died, my sister, who was my twin, and who quite frankly I was estranged from in a lot of ways, was upstairs overdosing on my mother's care package. The drugs that she was given, and it was just, it was one of those moments where it all collided, and it was a really difficult time for me. I wanted to be sitting in honor of my mother, and meanwhile I was upstairs directing traffic, administering CPR, sort of tending to that emergency and crisis. And I remember the day as clearly as I remember any day, sort of having to go outside and just collapsing. It's like, this is a thing that I can no longer do. And this is a thing that I can no longer do without help and support. I consider myself to have a lot of inner strength, but at that moment, it's like, I really need something different than I can give to myself right now.
Yeah. And when you say this is a thing I can no longer do, you mean just life at that point in time?
Yeah, shoulder it. I'd always been a really dutiful man. It's one of those things. It's always the one in the family that would hold it all together. And I was always, obviously, I was the one, whether it's in the community or whether it's, within my family. And so suddenly the burden became really great. And, one of those things that I found really difficult, which is an understatement, right? It was, for me, it was a crisis on a lot of levels.
What was the first ground or support that you landed on?
Yeah, I decided to go seek a therapist, and I was so fortunate to find a very gifted therapist that could hold space for me in a way that was just really profound. And I, with all humans, right, I hold us as whole and capable and able to solve our own problems and challenges. And he was a man that showed me what it looked like, right, to hold somebody in a way that allowed for that healing to start to happen. There's a lot of confusion in my life. I didn't really know what was going to happen. I mean, I didn't know what the next stage for my career was going to be. Obviously, again, I was in the middle of divorce. I had a lot of worries about my son in that time, and making sure that that he was cared for in a way that was meaningful to him. And then of course my family, and all at the same time, I was really challenged to say, what is it like that I need to be doing, and who am I going to become here? And at the time I didn't even know where I was going to be living, right? I was still living in the community that I'd spent most of my adult life in. So, the therapist, again, he was just, yeah, I couldn't be more grateful for him. And, it was a really amazing experience. And it helped me understand, right, that we need partnership in a way that I hadn't experienced before, right? My relationships were really important to me, but this is a different kind of relationship. And that partner for me in that time just really helped me understand a couple of things. And I had that experience also with executive coaching. Is we don't need to do this alone, right? We really shouldn't be doing this alone. We all need, help and support and care along the way. And that was a really important life lesson for me. It's just really significant.
So what came from that experience? So you started to see the therapist. His therapist was supporting you during this time to sort of unburden some of what you had been carrying. How then did you begin emerging out of that experience?
Yeah, the overarching question, as, as you might imagine, is what's next? Like, what even is the next step for me? And what I decided to do rather than rush into the next step was really challenge my values, right? Really try to understand who I was. And so, I did that. Like I was living up here a lot, not always here, but I was living up here a lot. And I did that sort of analytically, right? It's like, if I'm going to explore my values, I'm really going to explore my values, and I sort of challenge myself in that way. And one of the things that really surprised me in that exploration is that the value that I landed on, first and foremost, is love. And, the way I express it is love and the capacity to be loved. And when I realized that that was something that was really part of me, and really looked backwards to say, when I was sort of in tension with that feeling, it was obvious, right? Even in the workplace. It's like when I realized that the most anxiety or distress that I ever felt in the workplace is when the relationships weren't going well. Obviously the same thing was happening with my former wife. And that was, when there was tension there, the value that it was abrading was, again, love and the capacity to be loved. So every time I explored that, it's like, it was a bit of an aha moment, because that's not, if you had asked me on the street what my top 3 values are, I wouldn't have said, what I know now, and that is I am love, right? And that is who I seek to be. And so from that place, like, I felt like I had some footing, and I felt like I had the ability to run any of the things I was considering in terms of the next stage of my career through the litmus test of that. Right. And, if I think about that, when I seek that next opportunity, does it meet that value in a way that is wholehearted? And so what was obvious is, it's like, if you're on this, I had a burgeoning career, and every time I thought about stepping into a similar role, I just noticed that there was some friction there, and it didn't feel right. It every time, and you want to consider leveraging your past experience, but every time I considered thinking about that, it's like, it's not really meeting that criteria. It's not allowing me to live in alignment. And so that for me was one of the things that was really then, in some ways, unsettling, because, it's like, well, am I going to throw this out the window, all of the work that I had been doing? So I continued to explore, what could it be? And And that, again, it was very significant, incredibly profound for me. And in a random conversation one day, when I was networking and again, just sort of looking across the range of opportunities, somebody said, a person that I didn't even know, I don't get it. Why are you not considering being an executive coach? And I thought about it for a minute, and I ran it across this litmus test of, love and learning and, perspective wisdom and the things that I thought were really important for me in my life. And it seemed to check a lot of boxes. And it also, really incorporated my past experience in a way that wasn't throwing anything away, but was moving it into a really, really different realm.
What were some of the aspects of your past experiences that you are now leveraging in executive coaching?
One is just being involved in the business experience and, using the experience that I have as a foundation, right? In other words, to be informed when I'm working with an executive. It's interesting, Jonathan, because I think that past business experience obviously allows me to sort of gain new clients, but it's not the thing that drives me forward any longer, right? It's to be a loving and supportive presence for the people that I work with. And the thing that also was just incredibly fulfilling was to work with people, right? To become who they are in their fullness, right? I consider leadership to be also ontological, right? A way of being. And, when I think about leadership as a way of being and stepping into what that looks like, even talking about it, right? It fills my chest up. And it's like, who are you to become? So part of the experiences that I was having for myself was informing the way that I showed up to work with, clients. And I've skipped a step because what I did then, once I realized that that's something that I really wanted to immerse myself in, and quite frankly, I just committed to it almost overnight. I went to Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute, and that was a very, it was immersive and moving and not at all analytical. It was all hard work. And, they did extraordinary work there that again, sort of pushed me through another portal, so to speak, of exploration, because, if you're going to sit in front of somebody, and we know this as deep coaches, right? You have to do your own work. And so, that work then was, a continuation of, right, how do I do my own personal work to show up as who I am so that I can fulfill this promise that I'm making to myself and the promise that I'm making to people, right, to support them.
Oftentimes, executives and sort of a loving presence don't typically go hand in hand together in the way that we've come to know it. And you mentioned Berkeley, the Berkeley Institute of Executive Coaching, that opened your mind to that possibility. How were they bridging that gap between sort of supporting executives and coming from a heart-centered place?
Yeah. So the principles that they work with is show up and choose to be present, right? And in order to do that, you've got to do your own work. They really stretched you, right, to sort of get out of your own way, so to speak. Also pay attention to what has heart and meaning. And so one of the things that I think is really important in the work, of coaching work in general, is not, again, it's like, I'm not being directive. I'm truly sitting in the coach's seat. And what's important to me is understanding who you are at your core, who you are, what is your essence? And it wasn't at all about, right, the rigor of business, right? It became about, really understanding who people are and what moves them and what motivates them and what influences them. So that's really where the boundaries started to be stretched. And that's where I was stretching myself in many, many different ways. Once I left that experience, I kept on seeking out more. Really, really digging into other experiences that would stretch me as a person. But, the direct answer to your question is, sure, it's not about the face of the executive. It's about the heart of the executive. And we want to make sure to lean into that. And in so many ways, you end up being a Trojan horse because they don't know what's coming, right? If I really seek to understand who you are, and that starts to, unfold in the relationship, and you start to step into that choice for yourself every day, it's incredible, right? It's simply incredible.
How have you noticed executives responding to that Trojan horse? So they come seeking leadership support, executive support, and then there's a deeper loving presence on the other side. How
Yeah.
have they responded to that?
Yeah. We're all wired to connect, and whether we know it or not, we're all wired to connect at the heart level. And when somebody really seeks to explore who you are and connect to you at that level, my experience with it is, they blossom or thrive. And that to me is always just been, honestly, it's the same experience that I had with my therapist. Like, here's a man who's willing to hold me. Here's a man who's willing to help me move forward. Here's a man that's going to sit in a place that is non-judgmental. And to be a loving presence and to really be there for you in such a meaningful, in the deep coaching work, right? We say our being is the doing. And I wasn't informed in that way at the time, but that's the truth, right? It's just, we allow for somebody to emerge from a place where they might think it's about solving a problem, right? They might think it's about sort of solving the challenges that they have in the workplace, but really what it's about is allowing them to emerge, right? To bring their values forward, to step into that choice. And when we're informed by that, there's a lot of wisdom.
Yeah. How did the deep coaching intensive take your work deeper?
Oftentimes, so with us, that have gone through the work, if what it really allowed for me is to not shy away from the person that is at the center of myself, and that is love, right? It really allowed for that to emerge in a way that it was unambiguous. It really allowed for me to make connections to a source of vitality, which is spirit. That, quite frankly, was, I think, a key to, a much deeper place of existence for me. As I sit here, I can watch the aspen leaves quaking, and every time I see that, for me, it's like the breath of spirit. And, it helps me sort of be in a really immersive and deep place for myself. And again, that's a wise place for me, right? It's not that I'm always in a wise place. There are times, of course, when I am not in my full awareness and, on autopilot. And, so for me, one of the things that the Institute brought to me was the practices. It also brought that connection to spirit, which I think, I'd always had those moments of awe and wonder in my life, right? I'd always had that experience of being in nature and having it really fill me up. I really wasn't aware that it could be in connection with that anytime, anywhere, on, sort of on a plane, flying back home from, work engagement, and being able to connect to spirit in a way that just makes me feel so good. Just that really sort of, I just fills me up in a really profound way. And when you're operating from that place with people and supportive people, it's beyond fulfilling. And it oftentimes is blissful. Quite frequently it can be blissful, and no matter what's happening, in your life or in the world, you can connect to that and still show up for people. And that to me is, I think it's been the gift of the Deep Coaching Institute.
Yeah. Yeah. You had mentioned nature a couple times. Nature seems to be a pivotal part of who you are
Yeah.
and what helps you to connect to life, to yourself. Can you describe a little more about your relationship to nature and what
Yeah.
it does for you?
Yeah. I'm really blessed to be in a place where I can experience that every day. I mean, I'm really blessed to be in a place where I can walk outside my door and, be immersed in nature. I and my wife shares this, you know, n- nature is healing. Nature is enlivening. Nature is a connection. It's outside, sort of in bare feet, letting it all come to me is just something that it's source. When it really comes down to it, it's source. And so it's a continuous energizing force in my life. And I also know about myself that if I don't have it, I start to break a little. When it's not because when I'm not giving it to myself, I'm not showing up as whole as I otherwise could be. So for me, it's this just constant energizing force and connection to spirit um, that is so meaningful, and it really helps bring perspective. One of the things that I hold as value is perspective wisdom, and when I'm in nature, that's there and present all of the time. So it feeds me in ways that are, just really significant, really meaningful, um, lends to my vitality, uh, gives me, all kinds of motivation to bring people into nature also. I mean, I think that's one of the things that, through my experience that I really want to share. Um, and again, all of my past experience would say I tend to think things work better when we have some spaciousness in our lives. And, at its core, that's what being in nature is, right? It's so expansive. I mean, imagine being held by everything in the universe, right? And that to me is what it is, because when I'm in that expansive place, I'm at my best. And I tend to think most people are at their best when there is some spaciousness in their lives.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's no surprise that the moment you gave yourself a significant amount of time in that spaciousness, that's when the awakening
That's right.
began.
That's exactly right. Not a surprise at all. Um, and even in this environment where, I think I live in the United States, right? I feel like there's some really aggressive and still action happening here. Um, what the perspective of nature and again, spirit and the wisdom of spirit brings me is the ability to take that aggressive energy and turn it into something positive. To take it and know that I can create something from what I even experience as negative or, aggressive, and turn it into something that is meaningful and positive.
You recently wrote a beautiful piece on the gift of my anguish. I believe you titled it. Can you talk a little more about that anguish?
Yeah. Um, in that piece, one of the things that I was really trying to drive at is I have felt a great deal of anxiety, given the conditions that we're facing here. And when I really started to look under the covers there, because anxiety can be paralytic, right? It can hold you back. Um, I was also noticing that it was making it difficult for me to be truly connected. And when I say connected to myself and, connected to who I am and connected to spirit. And that felt threatening to me. It was a moment that I really had to explore. And so when I began to explore that, right, what I realized was under the covers there was that I care so deeply, and that, the things that I care about, people, the environment, were feeling threatened. And, to watch people be threatened, or, to see hostile acts, happen in the world, and obviously much more broadly than the United States, right? I mean, there's a lot of things happening in our world today that are really distressful. So when I started to think about care and love, that's what emerged from that, exploration. And what happened to me then was, how do I bring myself into alignment now so that I can have as much impact as I need to have, right? And that was instantly liberating for me. It was instantly liberating in such a way, and that I was able to act with strength and put myself out in the world, and even to the degree of just writing about that experience. Um, and on, I feel as aligned right now and as powerful right now as I have ever felt in my life. And that was, it's such a worthwhile exploration, because when I got to the core of that, it is, what do I need to do, and how can I be a contribution, and how do I let that love and care emerge from myself in such a way that it can have an impact? And, I'm doing pro bono coaching for C-suite executives with environmental nonprofits right now, because it's something that I really, obviously care deep about. And I continue to do my work as an executive coach, and that shows up for me in a way, again, that I'm standing in my power, so I moved to that place of power by purpose, which again, it was like stepping through another door and realizing that that's where I need to be all of the time. And, that again, I need to tend to myself in such a way that I can bring that forward. And, I like to think about right now, and I think you could probably sense the energy in my voice, is like love with a backbone, right? Love with courage, and, not be afraid to speak to the things that are meaningful to you right now, and not be afraid to let that love come forward in such a way that people know it and experience it. Speaking to love with the executives that I work for, right? Speaking to being a loving, supportive presence in my purpose in life, and continuing to work in that alignment. And, when those things have come forward, it's also crystallizing a vision of, how I will work moving forward and what that looks like for me.
That is so beautiful. That is so beautiful. Yeah, anguish often comes, or always comes, from a place of hopelessness, right? There's anguish because you feel like there's, what can I do? There's a degree of impotence to it. So
Yeah,
to channel that then and ask, what is under my control? What can I do? What is my role amidst all of this that is happening in the world? And then taking action in that direction, whether that be writing, whether that be the nonprofit work, the coaching work, you can see how there's a surge of power, because now you're doing what you individually are to do in this world for the betterment of the world in many
that's
ways.
right. I mean, it speaks to agency, which we
Yes.
all carry, right? We carry, the ability to have self-agency. For me, it clearly speaks to purpose, right? And there's a gift, right? So that's the gift of the anxiety that I was facing is now that there's something, it's almost like that I don't know if it's the last little bit, right? I don't know if it's fair to say that, but for now, what happened is I go like, okay, I'm clear. I know what it is. I know what it's going to be. I know how I'm going to live my life, right? And I know what I get to bring here. And, it's sort of this triangle of love and the environment, and, and the purpose of helping people move forward. It's just, for me, it's just so resonant. Um, and, I envision now, right, my life more fully in terms of as I work forward and about bringing executives into my space and into the wilderness. I envision continuing to be a presence for, the environment, the people that are working to, care for the environment. And when that really clicked in for me, it's like, I haven't been really working in that capacity. I'm out in it every day, but I haven't been working to protect it every day. And, I consider, again, that they're not separate, these things. I mean, they are, who I am at my fullest expression, and how I'm going to, continue to navigate this world, and what I'm going to commit myself to. And so, again, just like difficult times in our lives, when we flip those difficult times upside down, it enables a different future, and it enables the investigation, and it enables, right, continue, look inward, so that you can step into a life of purpose, right? So that you can work courageously, right, to create a better world.
Yeah, your life just seems like such a testament to what happens when we clear the channels, the obstructions that are within, that then allows us to really truly live our dharma, our purpose, our truth. Because that is the result of clearing the channels, is now the life force, life energy is now moving through us in such a way that it can support the ongoing evolution of our world.
Yeah. And when it happens, you know it. And
Yes.
it's available and accessible to all of us, right? I mean, in the journey of transformation, one of the interesting things that, like, I think many of us probably have experiences is sort of right there. It's right there, and it's always been there. And, then there's this, sort of this other motivation is to, like, there's many ways to live your purpose, but, when that congeals for you, the energy and vitality is unambiguous, right? You're not second guessing what it looks like. With certainty, right? There are many things you don't know, right, about how that will unfold for you. But it allows you to step into that every single day. And, that sense of clarity is just, it's striking.
Yeah, and right action reveals itself day by day. So there's not a thinking about it, or, you don't have to try to figure it out. It's just you are the expression of that which is needed day in and day out.
Surrender and trust, right? Give yourself
Surrender.
over to that thing which and trust that it will all manifest itself in a way, right, that is heartfelt for you.
Mhm. From the place of perspective wisdom, which I love that term. It's so right on with everything that you're sharing. From that place of perspective wisdom, if somebody is listening or watching this and they are sort of deep in the muck, asking themselves some of these existential questions, wondering what their role, what their purpose is, what insight might you provide them here in this moment?
I think the trigger point for me, and it came through the deep coaching work, the trigger point for me is, who am I? And, so when we're in the muck and when things are not clear, right, the person at the center of your being is wise beyond measure, right? And when you're able to, and it may not come quickly, right? I don't think there are any shortcuts to that. But I think the question is worth repeating over and over and over again until an answer emerges. And when you connect to that, wisdom lives there, right? Wisdom lives there. Even sort of in the case of anything that you might be struggling with, when you connect to that, wisdom lives there. And so again, I mean, I think patience is required. I'm a 61-year-old male, right? This didn't happen when I was 22 years old. That the journey's been a long journey. The last 15 years for me have been, very challenging in so many different ways. And it's worth living with that, right? It's worth continuing to ask yourself that question. But if you get to the central, who am I, right? When I asked that myself over and over again, and the only answer that continued to surface was love. Well, love is a very wise place. So whoever you are and however you want to sort of bring that into the world, I think that's my advice.
Yeah. Yeah. Who am I is the calibrating question. It really begins to, and oftentimes an answer is not even needed. It just starts to calibrate you and your life in such a way that aligns you into that which you are in the deepest, highest sense possible.
Yeah. The function of the disturbances in our life, right? The cleaving from the ego of being an executive, or the cleaving from the ego of being a father, in the way I used to be a father, or, a member of the community. The function of that, which can be really unsettling, is to move away from that and to step into something that isn't persona, right? That lives with you no matter what role you're fulfilling in the world. That doesn't have an attachment to how you externally present yourself in the world. That's just that real deep connection.
Yeah. I have yet to find a person who's living their truth and their purpose who has not gone through periods of extreme anxiety, tension, discomfort, where they're questioning absolutely everything. It is part of the human journey to experience a lot of these things. And it is the very material, right, that propels us forward into greater expressions of ourselves.
Yeah. We don't see these things as a gift when we're going through them, right? When the squiggly lines happen, we don't necessarily see. I mean, that was my experience at least. We don't necessarily see them as a gift. But it's really easy for me to now look back and see that as a gift. It's easy for me to see the tumult that we're going through in the world as a gift, right? Yeah.
What are the characteristics of the type of leadership you feel this world needs more of?
I start with compassion. A heartfelt willingness, right, to be a compassionate soul. And if we can be compassionate, again, it's a really wise place, to be very understanding. I was thinking about that, on a flight recently. It's tolerance, no matter what, to me is another thing that is really important in this world. Right. So I may not identify with some of the politics there, but I can, if I go deep, I can understand how people were influenced, right? And, what that conditioning might have been that led them to a place that isn't necessarily compassionate. And so I tend not to sit in judgment of people. And I think it's really important for us to be compassionate and tolerant and empathetic, right? Because if we can be empathetic, and it doesn't matter if you don't have to share my point of view, right? You don't have to share my politics. That's not interesting to me, right? I just really want to know what shaped you. And I really want to know whether or not you're open to being challenged with your beliefs. And again, you don't have to share my same beliefs. I just like you to elevate, right? Look all the way around that. Understand whether or not those beliefs are serving you. And if you make the choice to move forward with those beliefs, that's your choice. Like I don't tend to feel that friction with people ever. And I think as a leader, if we could walk around our buildings or walk around our communities, however you're choosing to serve as a leader, and sort of look at the thought bubbles that are happening over people's head, I think it would shape you to be a compassionate leader in a way that could help, right? Create a world that we want to create together.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. It's interesting because we recognize that in order to get to this place of living our purpose, living our truth, we recognize that we need to go through some muck, some, disturbance, sort of life destruction. But we kind of don't see that being the case for society, and that might be what we are going through right now,
That's
which
right.
is that on a macro level, that just self-destruction of old ways of being, and the old ways not necessarily serving. And so there is an awakening. The optimist in me sees an awakening on the
Yeah.
other side of, on the
Yeah.
collective. We are going to come out of this stronger, more deeply connected to our collective truth, and begin living in a way that is hopefully more harmonious as a whole.
I think that's insightful. I share that belief, right? At this moment in time across the world, we're looking into a mirror,
Yeah.
and we have to resolve whether we like what we see there. And, what I like about sort of that challenge, I don't like what's happening. But I also believe, in human goodness. And when we do look into that mirror and we do see the things that are unfolding, and we do challenge ourselves to say, is this okay for me? Or do we want this for ourselves? I tend to share the same belief. I tend to believe that this will be an inflection point for something that's going to be really, really important for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Because as folks then engage in the work of clearing their inner channels, then each little cell that's in different pockets of the world starts wakening, to their own truth and their own sort of role in this world. And yeah, hopefully things start to, then the ship starts to right itself in a different direction.
Yeah. Now, you asked my question, when I'm in nature, I feel held by nature and everything, and we all are, right?
Yeah.
We are all a living, breathing organism. We all belong to the same. And, there's often conflict. It's just like there's conflict within the body, right? There's cells that attack, other cells. And, there are places where we can sort of explore that and know everything doesn't have to be harmonious all the time. And it would be futile to think that that would be happening. But, when we collectively come together and again, examine the behaviors that we're witnessing and challenge ourselves to something different, I think, again, I hold hope out.
Yeah. Yeah. Chris, as we begin wrapping up this conversation, if you could leave listeners with an invitation, so something to reflect on or practice in their own transformational journeys, what might it be?
Um, I would leave them with the invitation to immerse themselves in the first practice, right? Um, it's obvious that it serves me, but one is to to slow it all down, to really sync with the rhythm of nature, right? Um, to really allow for some spaciousness and to create the space that you need, right? To see the things that you need, to gain the perspective that you need. It doesn't happen in a hurried life, right? I can challenge my language there, but it doesn't happen, in the end-to-end life when we're rushing from one thing to the next, right? When we really sit with ourselves, when we really sit in spaciousness, um, I think many things unfold that are worthy of, right, sitting with and being with, and there's a lot of beauty in that. And again, as we explore that, it's even in the conflict, right? Even in what you're struggling with, and even in sort of being with something that might be really difficult for you, a lot of beauty can emerge from that place.
Yeah. What might this more slowed down way of being look like realistically for you when you had a young son and you were rising in your career, right? Because there's periods of our life that are more conducive to
Yeah.
being slowed down and living a slowed down life versus others.
You know, for me, what I discovered at that time was an hour in a sea kayak on a paddle in the middle of the ocean, right? an hour on a single track trail in the redwoods, a half hour taking a walk as a break from that really busy day, in a place where you can acknowledge everything that's happening around you, and to be with it, right? To sit on a park bench and watch the rustling leaves of the tree and just really take that all in. We can create 15 minutes of time for ourselves, to be with something that is really meaningful and not to avoid it, right? A lot of people are uncomfortable with space and silence, but sit in the discomfort, be in that discomfort.
Yeah. Find your pockets. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you haven't shared that would be worth sharing before we close?
Yeah. I guess it's another invitation. And that is to step into your fullness, and to be courageous. No matter what is important to you, courage is required. I've come to think that, and I've shared this with some of the teams that I've been working with lately. It's like, I don't think leadership courage is optional. I think it's something that we all get to step into, and we all get to have impact no matter what we believe in, what we want to see happen in this world. But I think courage is a word that's been ever present for me lately. And I think we all have the opportunity to be courageous.
Beautiful. Well said. Such an insightful conversation, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. And thank you for your presence and everything that you're doing in the world.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for the gift of you, for the gift of this community. And it's really been a pleasure getting to know you also.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us today. To learn more about today's guest, visit our podcast landing page at www.podcast.centerfortransformationalcoaching.com. You'll find links to their website, social media, and anything else they might want to share there. And if you're curious to explore more about our work, our trainings, or the deep coaching approach, you'll find everything at www.centerfortransformationalcoaching.com. A new episode of this podcast releases every 2 weeks, so please subscribe wherever you listen to stay up to date. Until next time, stay present, embrace love, and continue sensing into what life is calling you toward. See you soon.